Hello, everyone. This is Chris Martin with Heterodox Academy. We're here today with Cristine Legare at the University of Texas at Austin. She is an associate professor of psychology there. She does a lot of work on cultural learning, how cultural knowledge is transmitted from older generations to younger generations, as well as from people within societies to other people. Even though she's in the psych department, she draws a lot on anthropology and philosophy as well. And she recently won an APS award for early career contributions. She's also on the executive board of Heterodox Academy. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So I wanted to touch on two topics today. The first is about your comment on how improving socioeconomic diversity is essential in the academy. I'm going to read a bit about that. And then the second topic is about teaching controversial topics when you're teaching students about psychology and cognition.
Right.
So to start, we celebrated the first anniversary of Heterodox Academy in September of last year. And your comment, I'm just going to read an excerpt. You wrote, "The lack of SES diversity within academia presents a formidable challenge to political pluralism and the free exchange of ideas. Many aspects of the academic pipeline perpetuate the lack of SES diversity. Most academic faculty at research institutions come from highly educated middle to high SES backgrounds." And then skipping forward a little bit, "The lack of SES diversity leaves faculty ill-prepared to dialogue with students from qualitatively different cultural backgrounds. Students from working class, rural, and conservative political backgrounds often report feeling excluded from academic dialogue." So can you talk a bit about why you thought about this issue?
For a number of different reasons. I mean, my personal background, I come from a working class family, and in navigating higher education, it has been very salient to me that the academy has a long way to go in promoting the recruitment and advancement of students who come from working class backgrounds. So I kind of have a personal interest in this. And I think also because of my my background, I feel a responsibility to advocate and support students who come from similar backgrounds. I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned in social science research in recent decades is how important representation is for people. And having a professor who comes from a background similar to students who have working class roots is empowering for students. It's something that I have found in many conversations with working class students, that giving them a voice and also some sort of a presence within a field of study, a professional field that many have never considered before. I mean, in order to even know that pursuing science and pursuing an academic career isn't even an option, you've got to be aware of this as a future trajectory for them. So I have that interest. Another thing that I have found in arriving in academia is my very clear awareness that there are very few students who are, very few faculty, both students and faculty, who come from working class backgrounds. So most of the faculty at elite universities come from middle class backgrounds or upper middle class backgrounds. And most of the students at elite institutions come from those backgrounds too, for a number of different reasons.
So do you ask students to self-identify, or do you sort of guess based on clues that they're working class and then have one-on-one conversations about them, about the relevance of academic life or the possibilities in academia?
Yeah, so I never ask my students about that overtly. There's certainly no reason that they should feel compelled to identify in any particular way that they don't feel comfortable doing. But I do talk about my background. And I talk about how important it is to have people from a great variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, all kinds of different cultural backgrounds in academia, that diversity is a source of strength. So I don't always talk about diversity in the context of socioeconomic status. That's personally most relevant to me. But I talk a lot about how programs that benefit people from diverse backgrounds, how they are successful, and roadblocks that prevent their success. And in fact, the group that has benefited, at least to my knowledge, most from things like affirmative action programs are white women in science. And I talk about that quite a lot. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what diversity looks like. And most people, when they see a Caucasian woman in a professional occupation or in academia, don't think of me as someone who benefits or has benefited from affirmative action or programs that promote diversity. But I absolutely have. I was a McDonald's a scholar when I was in as an undergraduate, and a variety of different programs that I personally participated in are responsible for my trajectory and my willingness and my ability to get a PhD.
I think I can relate to that too. I went to a small liberal arts college, and I'm originally from India, and I think they specifically allocated money to give scholarships to foreign students so that there was more international diversity there.
Right, absolutely.
I don't think when people look at me either, they think of me as someone who's recruited to increase the diversity of the undergrad population, but I believe that was part of the reason for that initiative. So what is UT Austin doing at the moment to increase SES diversity?
So they're doing a number of different things. One of the things that they support, I was actually part of the same program at UCSD when I was an undergraduate, is the McNair Scholars Program. There's a McDonald Scholars Program, but there's also a McNair Scholars Program. And this program is designed to increase the number of students who pursue graduate degrees of a variety of different sorts. So the UT Austin supports this program. I actually currently mentor several McNair students myself. There's also a program called the SURE program within psychology, and I believe a few other disciplines that have similar goals, is to give undergraduate students from diverse backgrounds, and this can be diverse in terms of ethnicity and socioeconomic status, some research experience. So those are specifically targeted towards increasing the pipeline of students who pursue academic careers or just pursue careers in higher education of some sort. We also have a top 10% rule in our admission at the University of Texas, which is designed to increase the diversity of students in a variety of different ways in entering the university. So if you are in the top 10% of whatever high school you attended, you are guaranteed admission to a University of Texas campus, and so this certainly increases the diversity of students coming in. One of the challenges is to retain students who come from these diverse backgrounds and get them successfully through a college degree. So one of the things that we find is students there's enormous, as I'm sure you know, educational inequity in high schools, in elementary schools in Texas, but also throughout the country. So students who come from underrepresented or often underprivileged backgrounds, who aren't attending high schools, for example, that have the same educational rigor and quality as students that are coming from much more well-funded areas, are at a disadvantage in the rigor, often at a disadvantage in the rigor of their educational preparation. And once they are admitted into University of Texas campus, the expectation is that they are going to perform at the same level as other students who had far more advantages. Often students who come from lower SES backgrounds have to work. That's an enormous burden in keeping up with very, very rigorous coursework. So one of the things we're attempting to do is level the playing field in providing more rigorous training and summer training programs that are focused on writing, are focused on strengthening mathematical skills, that will bring them up to the kind of same level as students who had a lot more of that training and opportunities in high school. So there's a focus on attempting to do this, but we're not doing as well as we should be doing, and that's something I know the university is recognizes and is working towards.
I've heard that from psychotherapists I've interviewed as well. Some of my research involves interviewing psychotherapists who work at colleges, and they told me that one of the primary stressors for low-income students is the inequality in educational background, because there are some students who come from very prestigious high schools who essentially have a year of college during their senior year. They take very advanced courses, and that can be very intimidating when you're a low SES student and you've had almost almost no AP courses. And he said one of the challenges is colleges try to make up for that by having remedial programs, but those programs are so short, it's hard to get a lot done. So there's
No,
still
it's
a lot of
true.
stress for low SES students.
Absolutely. So there's the issue of, an intensive summer program not being sufficient. It's clearly better than nothing, but a lot of these programs are contingent upon providing financial support for students as well. Many students aren't in a position where they can just take the summer off and take these courses in the first place. So even aside from them not being sufficient, there are major issues with students having enough resources to even participate in programs of that sort. And full load of college coursework is daunting, even without having to work 20 to 30 hours a week, and just in order to provide for basic necessities. So this is a kind of multi-pronged approach is clearly necessary to provide sufficient support for students who haven't had the same opportunities, and also to increase awareness among students and faculty who came from backgrounds with far more resources, to recognize that these things are really important. Right? If you've not had the experience of someone from a different background, you're not necessarily aware that actually the playing field is not equal, that students are not coming in with the same opportunities, that is deeply ignorant and a function of a kind of lack of perspective of people who come from very different backgrounds.
Right. And another thing you mentioned in your comment for our first anniversary was that it actually increases the political diversity too, because working class families tend to be relatively centrist or conservative. And I found too in my own research, there are contrasts. So even if you look just at Democratic voters, the cultural attitudes of working class Democrats are actually quite different from the attitudes of upper class, highly educated Democrats. So can you talk a bit about?
Absolutely.
Can you talk a bit about how you've seen cultural diversity improve, the politically speaking, viewpoint diversity improve?
Sure. So, a couple of things to say about that. In my own personal background, as I mentioned, I'm working class, but I come from a very a kind of traditional democratic working class family. It was also religious. I was raised Catholic, and so this kind of stereotype of rural working class people being conservative and religious. These things don't always have to cluster together. I think there's quite a lot of diversity on those fronts, and the awareness that we have about this variation, I think, is fairly limited. But it is true that it also depends on the region of the country that you're working in. So
Right.
in Texas, because we are servicing students from this, the entire South, but focally from Texas, we get an enormously diverse student population. And it is true that a lot of our rural students tend to come from more conservative backgrounds, but it's also true that some of our much more highly educated students, or students that come from much more highly educated backgrounds, also tend to be more conservative. So it's actually, working in Texas has been a really unique opportunity to look at the kind of a spectrum of more students from more urban versus rural backgrounds, and how conservative and more liberal politics play out in a variety of different ways and intersections. And one of the things that I do in my classes is provide people with an opportunity to discuss these sorts of dynamics. One of the things that I found in classroom discussions with my research assistants, but also just students taking my classes, is an enormous dissatisfaction with the degree to which our government is promoting the needs and the concerns, addressing the concerns of the working class. Right? People are aware that people living in rural areas, from more working class backgrounds across ethnic boundaries, are struggling mightily. That's true in Texas. That's true throughout most of the country. There has been an insufficient, I think, focus across the political spectrum on the challenges that this particular group is facing with globalization and massive changes in our economy. And a lot of the students that I've spoken with talk quite a bit about that there's frustration about growing income inequality and lack of resources to kind of promote the economic development of of rural areas. So this is something that's a very salient part of everyday student dialogue and student conversation.
Okay. Well, I think income inequality is a nice segue into the next topic, which is controversial topics in the classroom. You mentioned that you recently, very recently, specifically taught about a number of controversial issues in a class on culture and cognition. Could you talk a bit about how you integrated that into the class material?
Sure. So I taught a course, it was actually on the cognitive science of religion, which tracks students across a great variety of different political persuasions. So I had students take the class who were atheists and found the fact that anyone would believe in a religion completely baffling. I also had Catholic missionaries take the course, people who come from evangelical Christian backgrounds. So the religiosity of my class varied enormously. The kind of social class background of students in my class also varied quite a bit. And it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of tackle a lot of these kind of thorny issues. I mean, religion is kind of inherently thorny in terms of the implications for social policy and all kinds of different beliefs concerning the right way for humans to conduct themselves, the degree to which the government should be involved in legislating different sorts of things. So it was a great place to really practice having these more controversial dialogues, which is, I would argue, what we're supposed to be doing in higher education. So it's just one example. I assigned John Haidt's Righteous Mind book because it's a great way to talk about religion and politics, which the students were absolutely fascinated by.
So you signed the entire book?
What's that?
Did you sign the entire book?
We read the entire book, every word of it. Yeah, and the students absolutely loved it. And so one of the things that I had them do as assignment for this book was to use moral foundations theory to present arguments for and against teaching creationism in science classrooms. And the way the students were graded in this particular assignment was the extent to which both sides of that argument were equally persuasive. And so it was an opportunity to practice presenting both sides of an argument, including the side of an argument that many students very, very forcefully disagreed with. Right, so I wasn't arguing that we should teach creationism in science classrooms. I absolutely don't think that we should, but I do think that it's a useful opportunity to accurately represent and convey beliefs that are very different from your own. And students struggled with this a little bit, but really embraced it and took this on and gathered data from all kinds of different sources. They kind of spontaneously interviewed friends of theirs that were kind of young Earth creationists, and it was really fascinating, the extent to which they embraced this as a challenging and exciting assignment. But that's, I think, an incredibly useful skill. As a college student. You should learn how to present the perspectives of other people.
So if you were to give advice to a young professor out there who wants to talk about these topics but is scared of broaching them or scared of coming up with confronting students who have a very different viewpoint from their own, what advice would you give?
I think there's a couple things I would recommend. One is that I view my role as an educator to reach students from all backgrounds. So my goal is not just to reinforce the beliefs of students that already think exactly the way that I do. My goal is to present them with a great variety of different perspectives and to have an intelligent and respectful dialogue. So a big part of getting students to participate is giving them the impression that that you respect their perspectives enough to hear them through, that this is a space where different viewpoints are encouraged, but it's also a space where everyone has to be respectful. That if you want people to listen to you, you need to listen to them and not just give them a kind of pause in a conversation to say something, but to genuinely hear what they have to say. If you model that sort of dialogue in a classroom, students will do the same sort of thing. And the feedback that I got from this particular class was that this was an entirely different educational experience than these students had ever had before. Not just because it was an opportunity to talk about the evolution of religion and where religion comes from and what religion does in human society, because people are deeply interested in religion. Most Americans are religious, and even if you're not religious, understanding why most people are, I think or many people are, I think is interesting. So it wasn't just interesting because of the content. It was interesting because we had topics that we had conversations about topics students already spend a huge amount of their own time thinking about in a respectful space. So modeling that sort of thing, I think, is essential. And not being judgmental, being respectful but not judgmental.
And do you think having them read the book before they brought these topics up was helpful, so that they had some way of seeing why people from different perspectives would disagree with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very, very helpful. I mean, keep in mind that was the second book that we read. The first book that we read was on was R. Norenzayan's Big Gods book, which is all about the evolution of religion, which is quite it's a very different way to think about religion than the way most religious people do. So thinking about it in a much bigger picture sense, certainly introducing the possibility that religion is something that's created by humans. All these things so we started out with controversy day one. Mm-hmm. And I made clear when I go in, when I start the class and it's in the syllabus, that this is what we're going to do in this class. This is all about really developing a 360-degree bullshit detector, which is my goal for all my students in all my classes. That we're going to tackle these issues and we're going to have intelligent discussions. And sometimes this might be a little bit difficult, but that's what you're here to do. You're here to think about the world in new ways. And it's not my objective to force my perspective upon you. My goal is to introduce you to a variety of different ways of thinking about the world. And if some of that changes your mind, if conversations with other intelligent people change the way you think, if you change the way other people think, then we have succeeded in some way, right? So I make it very clear that this is not a kind of top-down transmission of my ideas into your minds, right? This is bi-directional. This is a group-level process. And I know students learned as much from other students in the class as they did from me. This is a wonderful thing about having a discussion-oriented class, is you benefit from more than just the instructor.
So there were particular techniques you used to encourage discussion in a friendly way as opposed to a confrontational way?
So we do a variety of different things. One is that I model techniques in how to have a productive conversation. I think it's also very helpful to have a kind of warm and interpersonal rapport. So I spend a lot of time in office hours with students. At the very beginning of the semester, I have them all come and see me in my office, and having that personal connection, even if it's a fairly small connection, I think opens people's minds up, but also reduces their defensiveness. So the more they can see me as another person who respects them and is kind of interested in who they are, the more they're going to trust me. And when I kind of push back on one of their ideas, they're going to say, oh, maybe she has a point there. This isn't necessarily a kind of personal attack on me by someone I don't know and don't trust. So we do lots of one-on-one conversations, small group discussions, in addition to a large group discussion. So we don't necessarily start out the course with tons of kind of controversial big class discussions. We kind of ease into that more gradually. And by the end of the semester, a huge portion of our time is just having a full class discussion about the topics. Another very interesting thing we did in this class is, based on the kind of Big Gods book, is the students in groups constructed their own religion based on the kind of Big Gods principles, which they absolutely loved. They were so excited about this. They spontaneously met outside of class. They came up with complex algorithms for religions. There were lots of big goddesses that were very popular in this assignment. So having introducing some creativity and innovation and intrigue into a class, I think it can be really game changing, and students just enjoy it so much. So do instructors, like myself.
Yeah. I teach a course on the sociology of happiness, and I broach the issue of religion and why religiosity has waned in the U.S. I tend to show them excerpts from a Christian Smith lecture, because he does a lot of survey work on declines in religiosity, particularly among Protestants and Catholics, and he's a practicing Catholic himself. So he's very critical of the idea that religion and science are at war with each other. He calls that the inherent warfare model, and he's very critical of that model. And
right, and that's a totally destructive and unnecessary model. One of the things that I have actually studied in my own research is how good people are at integrating different kinds of explanations at different levels of causality. So in the human mind, integrating religious and scientific explanations for things like biological origins is no problem at all. I mean, theistic evolution is all about kind of pushing God back a bit in a distal sort of way and putting evolution in as a more proximate mechanism. There's lots of ways that people reconcile scientific and religious explanations. So we talk quite a bit about that. There's no need to introduce or exacerbate the kind of cultural warfare that we're seeing going on. So a big part of my goal in this particular class was to present a different model of how people could dialogue about these sorts of topics. Another thing I want to mention is, in addition to modeling constructive ways to have a dialogue, I also model a few examples of bad practice, if you want to put it that way, or ways not to have a constructive dialogue. So there are
saying, if you can't be a good example, be a terrible warning.
So there were a few terrible warnings there in some case, and I used examples of both very religious people as well as atheists, and ways in which people from both of those camps did a good and a bad job at reaching others. And I also use this as an opportunity to talk about how particular styles of argumentation are not persuasive. They're meant basically to further endear you to people who already think the way that you do. And that's kind of psychologically satisfying for people, but that's not constructive. That's not useful. So when you get a famous atheist scientist going on and on and on about how stupid religious people are, his goal is definitely not to convert. His goal is not to persuade. From a persuasion perspective, that is entirely ineffective. In fact, I would say destructive. So we had an opportunity to discuss good and bad ways to present your information, and the degree to which persuasion is what you're attempting to do. Or just education. It doesn't necessarily even have to be persuasion. It could just be presenting your information in the most effective, accessible way possible.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating course. One of the things that I could do is maybe post a copy of your course syllabus if if it's online. I could share a link in the notes to this YouTube video, and I should do that, as well as links to the books you mentioned, Noren Zion's book and Jonathan Haidt's book, of course. Can add links to those as well. Well, I'd like to wrap up now. Any final thoughts or comments?
I think that my final comment would be one of optimism. So I've certainly found in my courses that students are much more receptive to diverse ideas than I think they're often portrayed to be in popular media. A lot of the experiences that I've had in discussing thorny political topics have been extremely positive, and that students have been quite grateful and enthusiastic about that opportunity, and that it didn't devolve into chaos or negative affect, just the opposite. So it's not to say that there isn't skill associated with having constructive dialogues, but I think that we've been overly cautious in avoiding potentially controversial topics, and there's, I think, no reason for that. This can be done productively with excellent educational outcomes.
I think on that topic, I think one thing that's affecting culture now, the culture of academia, is that sometimes a professor will hear about another professor who got in trouble for teaching a controversial topic, and they'll generalize from that and assume that it's a very risky thing to do. So it's good to have that optimistic perspective and realize that students consider these courses some of the best courses they've ever taken. I think it's
No,
important to see
it's
the
true.
value there.
It's true. But there has to be a deep level of respect in having these dialogues. So I think one of the ways in which this can go sideways is if students don't feel respected, and they don't feel that the instructor is as truly open to diverse perspectives. I mean, the only way these things work is students have to know that you are open to having your mind changed too. So I mean,
Right.
I think there's a kind of humility that is required in having these conversations for them to be maximally productive. And there could definitely be more emphasis on educating faculty about how to lead discussions of this particular type, not just as they relate to political diversity, but just kind of controversial topics more generally. I mean, our goal is to produce a more educated, enlightened citizenry. That's what I'm
Mm-hmm.
attempting to do, more than
Right.
to transmit any particular type of content. I want students to be critical thinkers, to be engaged. I think one of the things that inadvertently has happened in recent generations is this great aversion to politics, a sense that it's a nasty business and that it's the responsibility of others. This has been extremely destructive. We see this in voter turnout, getting students and young people engaged in the political process, engaged in the future of the country and the future of the global economy, and all of those things are a big part of what universities should be doing, and that's another thing I attempt to do in my classes.
Great. Well, maybe 6 months down the road or a year down the road, we can have a conversation about how
Great.
exactly to train professors to do a good job at this. But thank you
Yeah,
for your time. I really appreciate it.
absolutely. It was lovely to talk with you.
Thank you. Thanks. All right. Bye.
Bye.